Hello, everybody. This is Bryon Nelson Jr., the administrator of the Leave It to Beaver fan club on Facebook, as well as the new Leave It to Beaver / Still the Beaver fan page on Facebook. And today we're going to be talking to Stephen Talbot. He played Gilbert on Leave It to Beaver, and we're going to talk about his career as well as his father's career, Lyle Talbot. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the interview.
Hello.
Steve, how you doing? It's Bryon Nelson.
Hey, Bryon. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. How are you?
Good, good.
Excellent. Maria, are you there?
I'm here.
All right, we got Steve. Steve, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Awesome.
Well, hi there. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. Well, let's get started. Thank you, Stephen Talbot, for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
Now, your father, Lyle Talbot, he was no stranger to Hollywood. According to IMDb, his career spanned far as back as 1928. Now, were there any characters that stand out to you that he had done?
Yeah, well, my father, Lyle Talbot, was a person who spent his whole life on stage, in the movies, or on TV. And as some of your fans probably know, he was even in a couple of episodes of Leave It to Beaver, and even one episode of the new Leave It to Beaver series. He lived to the age of 94. He had been born in 1902. So he spent the 20th century acting. And he grew up in the Midwest and was a stage actor for a long time. And then when Hollywood invented what they then called talking pictures and needed actors who could talk, they recruited stage actors from all over the country, and he was signed by Warner Brothers. And he went to work for Warner Brothers in 1931 and was a contract actor there in a heyday of movies with people like Bette Davis and Humphrey Bogart and Jimmy Cagney and Barbara Stanwyck. And he made, in his career, I think a total of something like well over 150 movies. And for a period in the early 30s, he was really a kind of matinee idol movie star. He was very, very handsome, played a lot of gangsters, and he ended up acting, opposite everyone from Shirley Temple to Mae West. So he had quite a range. And as he got older, and he was an organizer of the Screen Actors Guild, and that got him in some trouble with the studios, who weren't crazy about having a union for actors back in those days, but it all happened. And he had later a very kind of wild career as a character actor in all sorts of movies. He played the Commissioner Gordon in the serials of Batman, and he was the first Lex Luthor villain opposite Superman in serials that were made for movies for kids, matinee audiences, back in the late 40s. And then he went on to a long career in TV, including being the next door neighbor on the Ozzie and Harriet show, where he played Ozzie's buddy, Joe Randolph, for over a decade. And then he went back to the theater and toured the country in plays like The Odd Couple. He was in a revival of South Pacific at Lincoln Center. He acted, well into his 80s, even narrated a couple of documentaries that I made for public television. So he had a long, long, long career.
Oh, absolutely.
Can I interject here with a question about, since you mentioned Ozzie and Harriet, I would like to ask you, with your dad being a regular on Ozzie and Harriet, did you and your family have a relationship with the Nelsons off screen?
We did. It wasn't very close. My dad and Ozzie were very close, to the extent that, for instance, during the summer, TV series usually knocked off. They didn't film during the summers. And many, many Hollywood actors in TV shows would do summer stock. They would tour the country in plays. my dad did that all the time. Those were our family vacations. We would all pile into my dad's station wagon and roam the country and play big cities like Chicago, Boston, but also a lot of small towns in 10 theaters. And he would do plays, he was also a regular on what was called the Bob Cummings Show, or Love That Bob. He played Bob Cummings' Air Force buddy. And he would go out on the road with people like Bob Cummings. And Ozzy, who was a control freak, Ozzy was always wanted to be in charge of everything. But he let my dad direct him in a play that they took on the road. And it was this silly little sex comedy that starred Ozzy and Harriet, my dad, who was also the director. And in the first iteration of the cast, it was Sally Hot Lips Kellerman. And the four of them would travel the road. They did that play a bunch of times throughout their life. So my dad and Ozzy were close professionally. And, we would see them. We'd go to parties at their home. As a kid, I was very impressed with Ricky Nelson.
How much younger are you than he? I was trying to picture the age difference.
I don't know exactly, Maria, but he was a teenager when I was, 10 and 12, right?
Gotcha.
So
yeah.
He was already on the show singing rock and roll songs at the end, which was one of those strange anomalies of Ozzy and Harriet, where Ozzy and Harriet was kind of the straightest series on television, and it was, of course, incredibly long running. It had been a radio program, very, very popular, but it was really for old people, and a lot of us thought it was very square at the time. But then Ozzy, who had once upon a time been a jazz band leader way back in the 1920s, and Harriet was the singer in his jazz band. But so he knew music. But when Ricky became a rock and roll star, Ozzy put him on singing at the end of every show. So it was this strange thing. You'd see this, kind of old-fashioned sitcom, and then up would come Ricky singing a rock and roll song.
It was wonderful because we saw those kids grow up in that series. When it started, Ricky was like 10 years old and had braces and was a scrawny little thing, and then we see them become what they became.
That's right.
All right. Could you tell us about so you grow up in this kind of Hollywood environment. Are you sure since the beginning, I want to be an actor too? This is definitely what I want.
Well, yes, in a way, that's true, because my father was an older father. He had been married several times before, had lots of big Hollywood romances. But when he was 46, he met my mother, who was 20. Actually, they were 45 and 19 when they first met. And so there's a big age difference. She was blonde and very attractive, very vivacious. And he was going through a hard spell in his life. He was drinking too much, and he was not getting the best of roles. And she really saved him. Put them together. He stopped drinking entirely, and they were married until for 40 years. Very loving, close marriage, and had 4 children. I'm the oldest of the 4. So it was a very tight family, and my mother they had met during a play. My mom had come to Hollywood as a singer, a very young singer, to break into Hollywood, and she got a part in a play as an understudy. The leading lady couldn't go on. She went on opposite my father, and they fell in love and got together. So we were definitely a show business family. My dad just loved acting. He never did anything else his entire life, and he had this long, long career, and he just loved it. He loved acting, and he used to say he had never turned down a part, ever. Not sure that's entirely true, but that might explain some of the wild variation in roles that he played. But he loved acting. So he was also very proud to have kids as an older father. And from the time I was pretty young, he took my brother and me on the set with him to watch him work. And so we grew up watching him on TV shows, especially if it was a television show like Rin Tin Tin, something that we really liked, or a Western, then we would go and watch him. And it just struck me over and over how much fun it looked. These make-believe TV sets and camaraderie of a television crew. And also in the summer, as I mentioned, he always went on stage around the country. And so we kind of grew up, our vacations were backstage in the theater. So I watched him work, and I watched actors work, and I loved it. And so at a certain point, when I was like 8 or 9, I started haranguing my parents and saying, I want to get out. And the funny thing is that they would have been very happy, I think, if I or my brother or 2 sisters had turned out to be actors, because they really liked the profession. But my father was very skeptical about being an actor as a kid, because he had worked so much in Hollywood, and he'd seen a lot of kids have a very, very difficult time. He was friends with Jackie Coogan, who was in the Silent Days, played the kid with Charlie Chaplin. And Coogan became famous because he earned a fortune as a child in the movies with Charlie Chaplin, but then his parents completely ripped him off. And
wow.
So when he came of age, he found there was no money. They had stolen it all from him. And so California ended up passing a law to protect children actors that's informally still known as the Coogan Law. And it mandates that your parents have to set aside a certain amount of money that's for you when you become an adult. And that really changed and protected a lot of kid actors. So my dad was friends with Jackie Coogan. He knew that story very well. He always used to say he had made a movie with Shirley Temple. She was quite young, and he always really liked her. And he always said, Shirley was one of the few child actors he knew who had turned out well. Who
yes,
had a successful
we know career. About Judy Garland, and
that's right. So the long story short is that my dad said, fine, if you want to be an actor when you grow up, great. But not as a kid. Don't do it as a kid. Stay in school. My mom was very big on school, too. So both my parents had wanted all of us young Talbots to do well in school and to have a, quote, normal life, and then act later if we wanted. And
what happened to that plan?
At the same time, my dad is taking us, on the set all the time. And we're growing up backstage watching him act and meeting actors all the time. And, I was born in Hollywood, and I grew up in Studio City, which was North Hollywood. And everyone on the block worked in what we called the business. My neighborhood was not Beverly Hills, but it was a perfectly comfortable kind of Leave It to Beaver kind of neighborhood. And everyone on the block virtually worked in the business as writers, directors, stuntmen, actors. Marnie Milner, who was one of the stars of Route 66 and later Adam 12 and so forth, he lived a couple of houses up. So I grew up very much in that atmosphere where people took it not as something super glamorous, but as just the work everyone did. And Studio City, the town I lived in, was built around a studio that was Republic Studio, where we started doing Leave It to Beaver. So I begged my parents over and over to let me do this and to act. And finally they relented and said, okay, you can act, but you always have to remain in a real school. You can take time off to act, but we'll never let you sign a contract to be full-time with any studio or series.
So when you started appearing in Lassie and the Donna Reed show, which I watched last night, your segment, and all of these little one-episode appearances, you're not attending that studio school.
That's right. The law is, some of your fans might be interested, to this day, the law is that if you're a kid and you're acting in a TV show or a movie or a commercial, there has to be a tutor on the set who's a certified Los Angeles County teacher. And out of an 8-hour workday, you have to spend 3 hours in that studio class. Now, that can be broken up into silly little tiny, I think 15 minutes was the shortest fragment in between scenes. So, you know, you'd go rehearse a scene, go back to school for half an hour while they're lighting the scene, then you'd go on, do the scene, and then you'd go back, and while they were setting up for the next scene, you'd maybe get an hour of school in. And they clocked you in and out of the school with a stopwatch. So that's how it worked on Leave It to Beaver and all those shows if you were a guest actor on the show.
So you were not under contract on the Leave It to Beaver series, correct?
No. At a certain point, the producers of the show asked me to be under contract regular because I was doing so many episodes and I liked doing the show and we all got along. So they asked me to be in it, and my parents said no.
Okay. So the days you did film, the days that you were working, or the weeks, right? It's a 1 week situation for every episode, correct?
That's right. A half-hour show typically was, in those days, still, I think, shot in 3 days on film. And so for Jerry and Tony, who were under contract and were in obviously every episode, they had a routine where, you know, they would get a script on Friday. The family would, the main Cleaver family would rehearse it on Monday, and then we would film it Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, with Friday being a safety day in case something had gone wrong and you'd have to shoot it. But basically 3 days of filming for every episode of Leave It to Beaver.
So let's go back to the let's go back to when your dad was doing the serials, when he was doing. We talked the other day, and you told me a story about when your dad was working on the Batman serial. What happened? What happened there?
Yeah, so I was born in 1949, and my dad happened to be acting in that Batman serial at the same time. So as my mother went into labor in the hospital at Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in downtown Hollywood, my dad got a call on the set filming Batman and told his wife was about to have his first child. So he left the set and raced over to the hospital.
Boy, what a story that is. I'm sure that happens a lot in Hollywood, though, where an actor's working and then he gets called for a child being born or some other emergency and has to get up and go.
Yeah, and he was not going to be stopped because I say he was a late-in-life father and very anxious to have a family, very much in love with my mom, so he was not going to miss the birth of his first kid.
Oh, absolutely not. And going back to Leave It to Beaver, there's a couple. Well, there's you yourself appeared in, I believe it was 47 episodes or 57 episodes, which for a child that wasn't going to go into acting, that's for one television series, that's quite a few episodes.
It is, Bryon, and you know, from the age of 9, which is when I did my first professional acting, until the age of almost 15, when I stopped, I worked all the time. So Leave It to Beaver was the only series that I was in where I played a regular character, Gilbert. And
right.
So, as you say, I did 50-plus episodes as Gilbert over a 4-year stretch in Leave It to Beaver.
Now,
I was acting in other shows all the time. You know, Lassie, I did 3 episodes of Lassie. I was in 2 episodes of Twilight Zone, which...
This is kind of like the Twilight Zone with that guy, Rod Serling. Twilight Zone?
Happened to be my personal favorite TV series at the time, so I was thrilled to be in that show. I was in Perry Mason. I was in Wanted Dead or Alive, which was a Western starring Steve McQueen as a bounty hunter.
That's cool.
I started doing a lot of Westerns because those were the main shows on TV at the time. Donna Reed. And then I did a lot of shows that were for, you know, grown-ups. The Barbara Stanwyck Show. Well, Donna Reed, that was for all sorts of families. But I did sort of whatever was on TV in those days. I only did one movie, but I was working in TV all the time for very, very busy kids.
Now, again, with Leave It to Beaver, there's, like you said, there was quite a few that you were in. One of the notable ones is when you all go camping with Wally, and Lumpy and Eddie are going to crash that party. They're upset because they wanted Wally to go and help them get dates. They had dates lined up, but they would only go if Wally went for somebody. And Eddie ends up on a ledge, and you get to give him a piece of your mind in a way. Do you recall what that line was?
Well, I don't remember the line precisely, but it's something that he was a low-life creep. It was a very memorable episode for me, Bryon, because, slight backstory, Ken Osmond, the real-life person who, with the help of the very fine writers, created a very memorable character, Eddie Haskell, who became, part of American TV culture, as iconic a TV figure as ever there was. Ken was a really good actor, but, Ken was, I think, 6 or 7 years older than me.
Right.
And as all of you and all the members of the fan club know, he always played the two-faced, double-crossing Eddie Haskell. And he was always bullying and harassing and teasing the character of Beaver and all his friends, including me, Gilbert. So in all my scenes with him, whenever I was in a scene with him, he was the villain, and I was the guy he was picking on. And I never really got to know Ken on a personal basis, partly because he was so much older, 6 years in those, when you're 10 or 11, somebody who's, 6 years older is like a different breed of person.
Right.
I always felt like slightly intimidated by him and didn't particularly like him. So you can say he played his character really well because, Jerry and Tony will always say he was not like that in real life, that he was a really nice guy. And they knew him so much better than I did. But anyway, I always felt intimidated. So that was the one episode of Leave It to Beaver where Eddie gets a comeuppance, where, his attempt to terrify Jerry Beaver and his friends backfires, and he gets scared, and he falls off a cliff and lands on a ledge, and he turns into a whimpering coward. And then Gilbert is left to oversee him, and he is so lonely. He says, "Gilbert, talk to me, please." And Gilbert says, "What'll I say?" And he goes, "Anything you want." And Gilbert finally, one episode, gets a chance to yell back and tell Eddie what he really thinks of it.
You're a big, stupid creep and a dumb, wise guy.
Talk to me, will you, Gilbert?
Okay. What'll I say?
Say anything.
All right. You're a dumb, stupid creep and a big wise guy.
There you go. There's a line. There's a line.
Now you wouldn't.
Bryon.
I'm sorry. You wouldn't know if you might not know this because it might have been filmed separately. It was a one shot with him. But how would they make it appear like he's out on a ledge?
It's
or a
funny.
cliff?
I looked at that episode recently, and it's a little bit of trick photography.
They do it with trick photographing.
We did that. It was not outdoors. We did that on a studio set. That often was true of Leave It to Beaver and many movies and TV shows in those days. Mm-hmm. Still is sometimes. And I noticed, he's on this ledge, and then it's all just basically blackness, So I can't tell you exactly how they did that, but I know it was on a set. I'll tell you one funny story that just comes to mind. It's not Leave It to Beaver, but there was another show I did at the time called Law of the Plainsman, which was kind of an unusual series. It had an odd premise. It was done at Republic, the same studio where we started doing Leave It to Beaver, and it was about it was a Western, and the star was supposed to be a Native American, Indian, who had turned a lawman, and he in the opening first episode, he rescues a little white girl who is a survivor of an Indian attack on her town. And they become close friends. And in the 2 episodes, they're riding around trying to solve crimes. And in the episode I was in, she's supposed to fall down a well. And I'm supposed to be lowered down the well to rescue her. And I remember this very well because, first of all, her last name in real life was Gillespie, and her older sister was Darlene Gillespie, who was one of the Mouseketeers. She was in the Mickey Mouse Club. Annette, Darlene. And I liked the Mickey Mouse Club, so here I was working with Darlene's younger sister. I'm supposed to rescue her. And they created on a soundstage at Republic, like a 120-foot well that they filled with timber and debris and fake cobwebs. And most of the show is me being lowered down to pick her up and then being lifted back up with her. And I felt very daring as a 9 or 10-year-old doing the show, maybe 11. And they had me in a harness under my clothes. But she was pretty terrified and ended up, when I grabbed her, grabbing me around the neck, in effect, choking me. But I wasn't supposed to be choking. I was supposed to be rescuing her. And I wasn't about to blow it with Darlene's little sister. So I hung tough and got through the scene, and it was the biggest moment in that episode and something that's stuck in my mind all these years later.
Can I ask, can you guess what is your second most memorable scene in Leave It to Beaver that everyone in our group talks about as one of the greatest moments in the series? Funniest moments.
Okay. Well, I can tell you, maybe this will match. Maybe it will just be my favorite. There were many episodes that I remember and really liked doing. And Jerry was so much fun to work with. And we were buddies. I mean, Jerry's the one guy who I really got to know very well. And we were friends off stage, too. So, and Jerry's amazing because he really, from a very young age, even before he could read, he carried that show. I mean, Tony was a terrific actor and a really, really nice human being. Hugh Beaumont was a good actor who'd been a movie actor before. Barbara Billingsley was terrific. There was a very friendly set to work on. It was very easygoing. There's always pressure when you're doing a professional show, and we were kids working for adults, and we knew we had to hit our mark and know our lines. It was real work, and my dad would emphasize that, if you're going to act, this is a business, and it's you got to be professional. So I certainly knew that from the beginning. So that was the world that we lived in. But I must say, Leave It to Beaver was, of all the acting I did, it felt like sort of coming home to a second family, because it was some place where I always played the same character, and Jerry and I were friends and so forth. And it was my neighborhood studio when it was in Republic. I lived in Studio City. My mom, who was my guardian most of the time, you had to have an adult with you on the set. We would just roll down the hill from our little canyon house to the studio. It was like a 10-minute commute. And then we moved to Universal, and that wasn't much farther away. So this was all felt very, very hometown, very Hollywood kind of life. Now, what was my favorite scene?
Funniest scene, yeah.
Normally, my parents, who started out coaching me a little when I first started acting, eventually saw that I could do it and pretty much left me alone to do this on my own. They would check sometimes to make sure I knew my lines, run my lines with them at the house a day or two before I went to work. But they knew I could do it, that I liked doing it, so they pretty much left me alone, except for one episode where I was supposed to play, it was Beaver driving a car,
There you go.
That's the one.
That's the one. Okay, and Jerry plays the father, and I play the wife and the mother. And my mom, that's the one time my mom said, okay, this is a little different. You're mimicking, making fun of, but you're supposed to be playing a mother. And so let me give you a few tips. So that was the one episode of all I did where I can very much remember my mother taking me aside and, working me through that scene, helping me through that scene. And I
suppose it took a lot of rehearsing as well with Jerry.
A little bit. It was a lot of dialogue. But I must say, when I watched that scene, which I've seen, a few times recently, that's probably one of the best acting moments I had in that series.
You know what's kind of cool is
one
that
of the top moments. Go ahead, Bryon.
You know what's kind of cool is that I believe it was in that one too, but there was another episode where Jerry was pretending he was playing house with a little girl that he was babysitting. And so there were names that were thrown out there as, kids. And I believe this happened, the names that were thrown out with your scenes, I can't remember if it was, I'm getting the two episodes mixed up. I maybe or may not. But I know there were scenes like in, their names that were thrown into the scene as kids where they dropped names that were familiar. Like Gerald was one of them, which was Jerry's full name. Susie was another name that was used as a child's name, a pretend child, which is Beaver's sister's name.
That's funny. I wasn't aware of that.
So I don't know if that was just completely by accident because I know writers use names that they know, sometimes. A lot of times they don't, but regarding that episode, the car has to go into the street. So were you in the car when it was rolled back into the street, and how did they do that safely?
A really good question. I was in the car. We did roll back in the street. And the funny thing about that episode, like so many other Leave It to Beaver episodes, is so many people have experienced that in their lives.
I know I did.
So many people have had that. It's a little weird, but, it happens. Their driveway was not very steep, and we didn't roll very fast. And it was all filmed on the back lot of Universal, and that was sort of the suburban neighborhood, that recreated suburban neighborhood facades of all the houses, including the Cleaver family house. And that was totally flat. So how they actually stopped the car, whether Jerry actually had to hit the brakes or not, I didn't know. Can't remember.
Now, we were talking about the new Leave It to Beaver earlier. Were you approached to do the movie? And if there, I don't know if you turned down the movie, but then there was a series afterwards. If did they approach you about the series as well?
They did, Bryon. I was asked to be in the movie and in the series as well, and I said no. And I was actually, I think, the only person who they asked who had been in the original series who declined. And the reason I declined was pretty simple. This was the 1980s, and I had just started what ended up becoming, my career for all these decades that I've been alive, which is being a broadcast journalist and a TV documentary filmmaker. And I was working for the public television station in San Francisco, KQED. I went on to work for Frontline, the PBS series, for 20 years. And I was a serious reporter. I was doing sometimes investigative reporting. I was a foreign correspondent for a while. I was doing a lot of big social issue documentaries. The first two documentaries I made for KQED, which also became national PBS shows, first one was on nuclear weapons accidents, very heavy topic, and the second one was on an upsurge in racial and anti-Semitic violence that was taking place in California in the early 80s. So these were really serious topics, and I was the reporter, often on camera, reporting about these things. And, in that situation, one of the things you want to be is taken very seriously by your audience. And the last thing I wanted was for people to think of me as a TV actor. So it would,
especially in those days.
Yeah.
Anderson Cooper can get away with it today, I think.
Sure. Now you can sort of spoof yourself and your personality. I mean, I was not as famous as Anderson Cooper by any stretch, and I ended up, being more of a behind-the-scenes director and producer and writer of documentaries than an on-camera person. But, this used to happen to me, which was, I started out at KQED on a nightly news show, and I would come on the show and do some very serious news report, and then they would take questions from their audience, would be phoned in, and the anchor woman would get these notes saying, "Isn't that Gilbert on Leave It to Beaver?" And she, who was a pioneering African-American journalist, Belva Davis, who was not familiar with Leave It to Beaver, would be going like, "What the hell are these questions? Who are you? What's going on?" So there were a couple of times when it became awkward. So the thing is, I loved acting when I was a kid. I really, really liked being on Leave It to Beaver. At age 14, I decided to stop acting. I didn't want to do it anymore. I wanted to focus on, believe it or not, playing football in high school, hanging out with my friends from high school, and school itself was getting more challenging, and I always tried to do well in school, so I needed to spend more time in school. Couldn't easily take off time the way I had as a kid. So I made a decision as I was about to turn 15 that I didn't want to act anymore. And, maybe I would as an adult, but I didn't want to at the time. And then, as I became an adult, I said, hey, I know something about cameras and television and filming, but what really interests me is not acting, it's journalism. And once you do that, you make that decision, you cross the line. So, I wished them well with the TV series and with the movie, but it wasn't for me. It would have been too awkward.
Yes. I have one last question, and then it's Bryon. My last question, taking you back a little bit, just before you quit, you were in the Lucy show, in that episode where you're wearing the military school uniform. Because you've been in Hollywood and you've been in all of these shows, this is one more gig, or were you awestruck that you are working with Lucy?
A little of both. I was professional enough as a kid and had been around many movie stars and on many movie sets and on theater stages to not be too blown away by actors. It was funny. My heroes were sports heroes. One of my favorite Leave It to Beaver episodes was when we placed a long-distance call to Don Drysdale, who was then, a star pitcher for the LA Dodgers. Now, meeting Don Drysdale, that was a thrill, okay? But, meeting Gregory Peck, whose sons I went to school with, Gregory Peck's a great actor, but was I blown away at the time? No. Because I was used to actors. They were part of the business. So, Lucy, on the other hand, was a legend. Was brilliant, fabulous comedian, so it was an honor to be on her show. I will say that one of the things I learned on that show, two things. One is, behind the scenes, that woman was a sharp, smart, tough businesswoman. And she and her husband, Desi, had created their own production company. They, to a great extent, controlled their own financial control of that company and what the TV series they made. So they were shrewd, they were smart, and no doubt she had a tough time as a woman in a male-dominated industry, being really a pioneer in handling the business side. So she was, hysterical as a comedian and, funny as could be, and slapstick, and she took physical risks, with all her comedy. But boy, offset, she was all business. She was a serious, very serious woman. My dad knew her and liked her a lot, and they worked together many times in various shows of hers. So the other thing about that show was, as she did the Lucy show, it was done live in front of a studio audience. Bleachers were set up in her Desilu studios, and it was called live on tape. So you would come in front of a live audience, and they would do the show, and you would do it like a stage play, moving just scene to scene to scene. If you made a mistake or something went wrong with a camera, they could redo it. So they would stop and redo some scenes. But the basic idea is you played it straight through. And the laugh track was the actual audience. So it had the excitement of being live. And, little anxiety gets you worked up. And so it was fun. If I was ever going to go out on a particular show, it was great to end my career working with Lucy in front of a live audience.
That's a way to go out with a bang. Thank you so much for answering all my questions.
You're very welcome.
So now going back to the new Leave It to Beaver, your dad had a part in that. He played a dentist or orthodontist to Jerry's younger son. How did that come about?
Everything okay, Oliver? Let's adjust your bed. Wouldn't want to get any blood on your nice clean shirt. Okay, now that we're all comfortable.
Well, the funny story behind that one, Bryon, which I'll make short, which is that my dad, as I say, had a long, long career. In the 1980s, he was in his 80s. And he narrated 2 documentaries that I did, one on the mystery writer Dashiell Hammett. He did the voice of Dashiell Hammett for that documentary for public TV. And he narrated the documentary for me called World Without Walls, which was about a woman, a pioneering flyer named Beryl Markham, who had grown up in Africa. And he narrated that film. So I was able to work with my dad and win awards for those shows, and it was a real pleasure. But he, was working less in his 80s than he had before, but he still, wanted to work. And one day he got a call from the Leave It to Beaver producers that they wanted him to be in a show, but would he come down for an audition, essentially, an interview. And my dad wanted to do the job, but he was annoyed that they were asking him to do an interview, He thought he was well beyond that. But he reluctantly agreed to do it. And I happened to be visiting him at home in Los Angeles. By then I was living in San Francisco, where I worked with my family. But I was in LA visiting, and he didn't drive anymore at that time. And he said, he asked if I would take him over. So I drove him over, and I said, look, this is a little awkward because I have told them I won't be in this series. I don't want to go in and see the producers and talk to everybody. I'll just, drop you at the entrance. It was a Republic Studios. I'll just drop you at the entrance and wait for you. So that's what I did. I parked the car, and my grandparents actually lived in a small apartment right across down the road from that studio. So I waited there, and after a while, my dad came out, and he went in kind of cranky, and he came out smiling and happy because he got the part.
I would imagine that they probably, pretty much knew that they would give him the part, but it was probably a standard procedure. And, like you said, he was in his 80s, so maybe they just wanted to see how he would, come on camera, in his, years now. Even
absolutely.
Though,
no,
so
you're
they
absolutely right, right? It was a check. It was like, some shows are like whenever I did Lassie, you would have to go get a full medical exam, even as a kid, before you were on the show as a guest. because you were around animals. And so they just had the rule that that's what happened at Lassie. Other shows, of course, it's because of insurance for the shows, especially in the stage. They would often do medical workups on actors, and in the case of my dad in his 80s, as you say, they just wanted to see if they could still walk, would be good.
So when you were in Lassie, were you on the Tommy Rettig Lassies or the John Provost?
It's funny, I grew up watching the Tommy Rettig episodes, but when I was on them, I was in the John Provost episodes, and I did 3 of them. Here's a wacky story that's absolutely true, is I did one episode where another kid and I are playing with Timmy, who was younger and much smaller. He was a very, very short kid. We're trying to build a flying machine. And the idea was we were going to go up on top of a cliff overlooking a lake and build this, these wings, giant wings, and jump off the cliff and fly. And in the warm up in the episode, Timmy is a little nervous, so I go out on the rope to show that he's going to be tied to a safety rope so he won't actually kill himself when he does this. And I go over, and I remember I did my own stunt. They actually had small adult person who was hired to do this kind of thing, and they thought it wasn't realistic enough, so I ended up doing my own stunts on that. That was kind of a thrill and a little scary. And then it came Timmy, John Provost's turn, and the idea of the episode was he takes off in the wings and, of course, crashes into this lake and is rescued by guess who? Lassie.
Of course.
So we're filming this in some, scummy kind of pond out in the fringes of LA, sagebrush, sort of deserty land. And we're there, and it's a really hot day. And I hate to tell people this story if they don't already know it, but at any given time, there were multiple Lassies. There was the main Lassie, and then there was a Lassie who did the fighting scenes, Lassie who was the best runner. They had their specialties. So there would be, anywhere from 3 to 6 Lassies, all trained by the same family that owned the Lassie Collies. And so 3 of us, 3 kids, are walking out of this lake. We're covered with sort of this pond scum, and it's really hot. And the dogs are all jammed into the back of a station wagon with the back down, and they're panting away. And someone says, "Hey, how do you kids feel?" After this scene. And I yelled back, "All wet." And the sound of my voice, apparently, to one of the fighting Lassies, sounded like a command to attack. So
Oops.
One of the Lassies jumped out and ran towards us. And one of the kids saw him coming and sort of ducked, and Lassie grabbed on to my butt with a big bite, and was hanging on. And one of the trainers, I can't say whether it was Les Weatherwax, who was the owner or main trainer, or was somebody else, I don't really remember, came off and had to pull Lassie off of me. And there was a big commotion on the set. I was not seriously injured at all, but they took me to the nurse on the set, and she, a little mercurochrome on my butt or whatever she did. And I remember she was quite an uptight person. It was like, "You must have provoked Lassie." And I'm going, "Wait a minute, lady, I'm the victim here." But anyway, it all ended well. These days, probably someone would have sued, but that was not me or my family.
So my last question I have is this. There's a big debate always on colorization on Leave It to Beaver. So where do you stand on that?
I'm a traditionalist. I love the black and white. I love seeing black and white film. The shading, the lighting. Beaver had a great crew. They were real professionals, good directors, amazing writers, and they all cared about it. Cared about this series. none of them knew, and I certainly didn't know, that this would be a show that would have a life for decades and decades, and that here we are in 2022 talking about this series, and it still is on TV, and it has fan clubs, and it's part of American culture, and it has this light that none of us knew at the time it would have. Everyone was doing it as trying to make it the best possible TV show it could be. But, in those days, we didn't even think it was going to go into reruns. And when it did go into reruns, we all got paid very small amounts for second or third or fourth reruns. And then that was it. There was never any payment after that. So, for the actors, this was a very pleasant, interesting experience to do at the time and have a lot of pleasant memories from. But no one got rich from doing it, that's for sure.
Oh no, it's not like film and TV nowadays. I mean, heck, I think just one episode is ungodly amounts of money nowadays.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are wildly inflated. And of course, the union that my dad helped found, the Screen Actors Guild, over time has become a very strong and powerful union and has gotten great deals for actors. So, of course, if you're in a TV series now that goes into any kind of syndication, you're really paid very, very well for it. And, successful TV series can make a ton of money, and they're more and more expensive to produce. But back in the 1950s and 1960s, that was not the case.
Craft service tables nowadays are more than a whole production was back then.
Yeah, I mean, I know. Someone asked me a while ago, and I looked up. I was paid $150 a day when I was on Leave It to Beaver, and that was kind of standard for probably what I was getting in most shows. Now, $150 in the late 1950s and early 1960s was a lot more than $150 a day. So, I was paid well for my work at the time, but that was it. But anyway, to get back to your question, black and white, I mean, I'm a fan of black and white movies. Most of the movies my father made were black and white films. So I love to watch Turner Classic Movies. I go to movie art houses, or at least I did before COVID, to watch movies in black and white. I really appreciate the photography and the lighting. I like film noir movies, gangster movies, because of the dramatic lighting they have. So I'm not personally a fan of colorization.
We talked to Tony Dow, and, he's in favor of colorization, but he does also recognize that there's a fine art, in when you film in black and white. I mean,
I actually presented that as part of a package one time to Universal. I thought it would be a good way to get a whole new generation, because one of the things that kids were saying, this was 30 years ago or so, was it was hard to stay with the show because it was black and white, and they weren't used to black and white. The black and white one's more valuable, I would think, because they are the lighting on them, and it's really beautifully done.
There's so much you got to think about. I mean, you had to think about back then. I mean, wardrobe. How is that going to look on the screen? The sets, the walls, the tablecloth on the table, just every little tiny thing. And like you said, the lighting. It's got to look good on film. It's almost like it's almost like painting. Like you're painting with light. Because it's got to look good on black and white film, and you got to make it look entertaining, not distractive.
Absolutely, and any good director of photography or DP and lighting person would tell you the same thing. That's their craft. That's their art. And if they're good at it and they care about their job, they really want that to be the best it possibly can be. I'll tell you a funny thing about what plays in black and white and what doesn't. In black and white, they always used chocolate. serum for blood because it works perfectly. It looks like blood in black and white. So most of the time, what you see as blood in an old Hollywood movie or a TV show, it's chocolate. And I'll tell you another thing on Leave It to Beaver once. We were doing an episode where Jerry and I got to eat ice cream cones. We were supposed to be walking around with our ice cream cones, and I thought, oh, that'll be fun. Delicious. I love ice cream. So we got to the scene, and they gave us our ice cream cones, and the ice cream was not ice cream; it was mashed potatoes.
That is gonna wreck the scene now forever. I'm gonna look in the TV, and I'm gonna see an ice cream cone, and I'm like, oh no, that's potatoes. Not that I dislike potatoes, but
I love potatoes, but not when I want ice cream. And to make it worse, of course, they would dye it, if it were chocolate or something. So God knows what they put in it to make it dark. So, yeah, that was unappetizing. And then, of course, you have to suck it up. You were a pro and eat it as if it were ice cream.
That's kind of like when you go for a non-transparent container thinking it's chocolate milk and it's Coca-Cola or something totally way off base different.
Exactly. So those were the funny asides. The other thing I'll just say about Leave It to Beaver, which was interesting for me as I go back late in my life and look at these episodes and discuss them with Jerry or Tony, is that, of course, basically for me, this is like a home movie. I watch myself, and this is a little out-of-body experience. You watch yourself grow up because the first episode, it aired when I had just turned 10. I was 9 when I made it. And the last episode, I was 14. So think about yourself or any members of the fan club. The difference between you at 9 and 14. Totally different person. So physically. And you can see that in the Beaver episodes. And you see all of us age. And this actually happened one day. They were filming a close-up of me, a cutaway shot in a scene, and all of a sudden the director went, wait a minute, stop, cut. What the hell is that on your lip? And I was growing a mustache. I mean, I wasn't deliberately trying to grow a mustache.
Not like Wally.
It was my first hair on my upper lip. And the last thing they wanted was Beaver or one of his friends with a mustache. So they rushed me off to makeup, and my dad happened to be on the set that day as my guardian. I remember they called my dad aside and they said, is it all right if we shave your son's upper lip? And my dad that's my little boy, but he said, okay. I said, okay. And my first shave was in a makeup chair at Leave It to Beaver.
It's funny you say that because even the teenagers who are, Tony and Ken and Frank and, Julie Foster was played by Cheryl Holdridge. She didn't have any facial hair, but anytime you had someone that, was a character and they, Eddie and Wally, they were makeup too, and I'm sure they were growing mustaches. But the producers didn't want that on the screen, so I'm sure they covered that up.
They did, and here's another funny story. Jerry's voice changed before mine. He's slightly older than me, but anyway, his voice changed, and he was very proud of it. And so he would start deliberately doing low register reads of his lines, like, hi, Gilbert, how are you? He would sound grown up. And again, the directors would go, Jerry, what are you doing? Stop with that voice. You're a kid. And so Jerry would go back to, trying to approximate the voice he'd had. But the point is, we were all growing up on the show.
Right.
And in a way, the show came to a natural end because they, didn't want us to become Jerry and me and
Right.
Richard and Brady. They didn't want us to become teenagers. They didn't want to continue the show that way. So it felt like it had a natural end.
So when you watch the show, when you do watch episodes, now, granted, when people were watching it back then, they were watching it, once a week for 6 years. So growing up, seeing the characters grow up in a matter of 6 years seems pretty natural. But nowadays, you got, like MeTV airs 2 episodes a day. So in a matter of 5 or 6 or 7 months, everyone's all grown up. You got the DVDs, fans, they see it and they watch them one by one by one, and they see you grow up. Now, when you watch an episode now, like you said, it's almost, and Jerry has said this as well, it's like watching a whole movie almost. So if you're watching it, it's pretty hard, I would imagine, to watch it and get yourself involved in it, in the story, like you would at any other episode of any other show, because you're distracted about with stuff that you did that day. Like Jerry has said, he remembers who was doing makeup that day and who was doing the lighting that day. So when you watch an episode, you probably can't really watch it as an episode per se.
That's right. And this is true in my family. Whenever my dad was on TV, and he was on a TV show all the time, we would usually gather as a family to watch that TV show after dinner at home. And my dad, we would watch it and say, good job, Dad, or that was interesting, or that was fun. But then sometimes we would watch just a movie that we would all like, and we would sit around watching it. And my mom and dad would be into the movie, but inevitably, at some point during the movie or TV show, they would turn to each other and they would say, "Oh, that's so-and-so. I didn't realize he was still working." Or, "Remember, she used to date so-and-so, and then he had the big affair with blah, blah, blah." And my brothers and sisters and I would turn around and go, please, for God's sake, stop talking about who's in the movie and who is involved with who. We're trying to just watch the story. And they go, "Oh, yeah, sorry, kids. We'll never do that again. Sorry." And then 10 minutes later, it would start up again. So here I am now, in my early 70s, doing the same thing. I watch these shows, and that's what I'm thinking of. What did we go to the commissary that day? Did we see Alfred Hitchcock? Did Richard bring in one of his monster masks from his collection? Did we give the director a hard time, which we almost never did, but very occasionally we did, usually inspired by Richard, who was a wild man, great guy. But that's what you think about when you watch it. Now, I will say occasionally, especially if I haven't seen an episode for a long, long time, I'll be drawn in because the episode is, I'll notice, wow, this is really well written, or this is a more unusual episode. There's one, and I'm sure people have seen this one at some point, where the Beaver needs some wheels for a little homemade race car.
Yeah.
Tony, you're building, right? And he gets the wheels from a girl, Penny, who's got a doll carriage, a big old doll buggy, and he can't get the wheels off, so she says, "Well, Jerry, Beaver, just wheel it home." And so he wheels it across town, mythical Mayfield, wheels it home through suburbia to get to the house, and it becomes, one of the more eerie Beaver episodes, because everybody, including Eddie, are terrified of what's going to happen to Beaver, because he's a boy pushing a girl's doll buggy across town. And in the full long episode, he passes little girls and they make fun of him. He passes some guy who says, "What's becoming of kids today? Why are boys playing with this?" And Tony says to Wally says to his mom, there's the only thing that could possibly be worse than a boy pushing the buggy across town would be to be caught outside in your underwear.
And Wally had great lines.
And Wally had great lines. And, Eddie Haskell says when he hears about it, he goes to Mrs. Cleaver and says, "Whoa, I hope someone doesn't slaughter the poor little boy." So it's kind of terrifying, for Beaver. You feel like he's in some, Buster Keaton silent movie or, some horror film where, something horrible is going to happen to this guy just because he's trying to get some wheels for his race car. So, that's an episode where I watched and I thought, wow, this is, I got involved in this. I wasn't thinking of Richard and I were doing when we popped up in that episode.
And you actually stole those wheels, not knowing you stole them.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's been a great hour talking with you and reminiscing about your career. It's been fun, and we hope to see you in the group from time to time.
Good. Yeah, I'll be. I won't be there all the time, but I'll definitely drop in from time to time, and it's great for me to be back in touch with Jerry. We did a little interview show together not long ago, and it's great to catch up with him. I have good memories of the show, and to everyone who is listening to this, who gets pleasure and enjoyment out of the show now, more power to you. That's great. I'm glad to have been a small part of something that has lived on for a long, long time.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you around.
Okay, Bryon, Maria, take care. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Adios. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. My thanks to Stephen Talbot for joining me for this interview today. I also want to thank Maria Shaw, group moderator, who assisted in this interview. I want to remind everybody that Stephen Talbot will be appearing at the Gallatin Comic-Con in Gallatin, Tennessee on November 19th and 20th with several other Leave It to Beaver cast members. So long, everybody. Thank you for listening, and we will see you soon. Thanks. Bye.